In this video, I'm going to be sharing what I've discovered about Capitano, including his potential identity, his connections to the moon, Khaenri'ah, Naberius, and how his story could go in Natlan. To start off, I think that Capitano was most likely Roland, the Bloodstained Knight. Now, before you click away, I'm not going to be focusing on the stuff most of us have already noticed, like his mask or calling Signora by her surname. We're going to be doing a deep dive into his real-world influences, and what I've found is absolutely fascinating. Timestamps are in the description if you want to skip to something specific. Let's start off with a very brief summary of who Roland was for some context. 500 years ago, he was known as the White Knight, a noble from Mondstadt that favoured justice above all else. He served under Grandmaster Arundolin and was mentored by Rostam the Wolf Pup. They led an expedition to Khaenri'ah to put an end to the monsters at the source. Rostam died during this expedition, and Arundolin lost the will to fight, retreating back to Mondstadt. Roland's brother followed him through the different nations, but died in the forests of Sumeru due to a monster's attack. Viridescent promised the dying boy to hunt the monsters in his place, and this caused her to become corrupted by their blood, turning her into a monster too. Roland would later find her staring at her monstrous appearance in the water, and put an end to her before heading west to Khaenri'ah. Cutting through the monsters on his way there, he was covered in their black blood and the raven feathers that followed him. After this, he became known as the Bloodstained or Black Knight. This blood slowly corrupted his mind and body, hearing the whispers of the abyss from his sword, and scaring the people he saved with his appearance, causing him to never remove his mask again. He eventually arrived at Khaenri'ah and fought his way down to the bottom of the world, dying in battle in the monster's lair. Here, he learned that the people of Khaenri'ah were unjustly cursed by Celestia to turn into monsters, and so pledged his loyalty to the abyss. So that's the basic story of Roland. Let's look into the real-world lore connecting him with Capitano. We'll be focusing on the works Song of Roland, Orlando Furioso, as well as the character Il Capitano from the Commedia dell'arte for reference. Roland was an iconic figure of medieval Europe, a legendary paladin under Charlemagne who had an unbreakable sword known as Durandal. Durandal was forged by Wayland the Smith, a master craftsman of Germanic legend, who also appeared in Old Norse mythology under the name Volander. This has some loose ties to Mondstadt for the Germanic inspiration, and Khaenri'ah for the Old Norse inspiration that we'll get into a bit later. In most versions of the story, Roland is in love with a princess named Angelique, who marries another man. When he learns of this, he goes mad with despair and rampages through Europe and Africa, destroying everything in his path. His friend Astolfo travels to Ethiopia to find a cure for Roland's madness, where he finds out that he has to go to the moon, as that is where everything lost on Earth can be found, even Roland's wits. He flies up there in Elijah's flaming chariot, retrieves Roland's wits, and brings them back in a bottle, making Roland sniff them and restoring him to sanity. As you've probably noticed, this story has quite a few similarities with our Roland story, being a legendary warrior, having an unbreakable sword, and losing his sanity while rampaging through multiple nations. It could be that our Roland dying in the abyss parallels the madness of Roland in the story, and somehow when he was brought back to life, the corruption no longer affected his mind, though his body would still be scarred physically, which could be why Capitano hides his face. Roland's wits being on the moon stood out to me in relation to Genshin's world, as we find out from the boatman on Surumi Island that the souls of the dead travel up to the palace on the moon, possibly as a place that souls are re-entered into the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, as Yae Miko alludes to in her demo trailer. As for who this was, it's hard to say, but we do have a solar chariot in Genshin's lore, which may have some relevance to the flaming chariot Astolfo used to fly to the moon. Now for a few of the more obvious similarities between Roland and Capitano to get them out the way. The Mask of Roland does have some similarities with Capitano's helmet, mainly being that four-pointed symbol on the forehead and the general shape of the mask fitting into Capitano's helmet, but the two aren't exactly the same. I don't think this discredits the idea though, as the Crimson Witch set isn't what we see Signora wearing in the modern day. The same could be true for Capitano, having a new suit of armor created after becoming a Harbinger in a similar style to his previous set, but with minor differences. Speaking of Signora, Capitano referring to her by her surname could be a hint towards him once being a noble of Mondstadt and acknowledging her as his mentor Rostam's lover. Okay, let's jump back into the deep end. In the Berserker artifact set, which seems to also be about Roland, he's called the Invincible Berserker, and it tells of his battle against a giant monster that lasted for years, ending with him drinking the marrow from its horn after defeating it. This was likely inspired by one of the real-world stories of Roland, where he fought against the giant for 2 days before defeating it, but I'll talk more about that in a minute, as I think it could have some relevance to Natlan. The Berserker was said to have fought against gods, so it could be that he fought against the Tsaritsa in the depths of Khaenri'ah and lost, pledging his loyalty to her while mistaking either her or Pierrot to be the leader of the Abyss. I'll just note here that though the Berserker and Roland are extremely similar, both rampaging, being corrupted, the ravens following them around, and fighting monsters in the Abyss, the Berserker artifact set states that he never had a family, when it seems that Roland had a brother. This could be explained as Roland forgetting his past when he became known as the Berserker, but I just thought I'd mention it as it's the only thing going against the two being the same person that I can find. The information that got me to make this video is Roland's association with ravens, which reminds me of the Heart of Naberius that Ryandotter discovered, and always stood out to me ever since I read it in 1.0. I've found a lot on this, so let's start off with the raven stuff. Il Capitano from the Commedia dell'arte is sometimes called the Ungulevent, which translates to nightjar, a nocturnal type of bird. This doesn't seem to fit exactly with ravens until we look into the Germanic folklore of Odin being accompanied by a night raven, with modern scholars suggesting that this bird may have been inspired by the European nightjar, as the Norwegian word for nightjar is nathraven, or night raven. If you've seen my previous video on the King of Khaenri'ah, I think you can see where I'm going with this, as we already have an Odin figure in the lore, the previous King of Khaenri'ah, named Ermin. It would also tie in with Roland's sword Durandal being created by Volander of Norse mythology, so perhaps when Roland pledged himself to the Abyss, it was to the corrupted and indisposed King Ermin, or his body on the throne. This could mean that though Capitano works for the Tsaritsa, his loyalty is to Khaenri'ah or the Abyss. It also hints that Khaenri'ah and Mondstadt were on good terms in the past, if Roland's sword was crafted by a Khaenri'an blacksmith. Anyway, back to Naberius. He was the most valiant demon of the Ars Goetia, and is depicted as a raven with a hoarse voice, which fits Capitano and Roland's focus on justice, with Roland being covered in raven feathers, as well as the whole night raven thing we just covered for Capitano. I'd say they fit the name Naberius better than anyone else in the game so far, even though names from the Ars Goetia are usually reserved for gods. The Heart of Naberius could have been the last piece left of Roland after he died in the Abyss. Perhaps he even tore the corrupted heart out of himself as a way to purify the corruption, with his soul returning from the moon, able to revive him later on. If Naberius wasn't Roland though, it may have been a god or Khaenri'an that supported his actions, and potentially was even the one to bring his soul back from the moon. If so, they went against Celestia's natural cycle, and could have been killed because of it, with only their heart remaining. It's hard to say for sure who Naberius was with the tiny amount of information we have right now, so let me know if you have any interesting theories on him. One last thing is how the story might go with Capitano in Natlan. The story of Roland fighting against a giant that I mentioned before took place in a town in Spain, which seems to be one of the inspirations for Natlan so far, along with South American and African influences. He fought the giant alone for 2 days, both agreeing to rest at night. They used swords, sticks, stones, and bare fists, but neither of them could defeat the other. During the second night, Roland placed a stone under the giant's head as a pillow, and upon waking up, the giant repaid his kindness by telling Roland that his only weak point was his navel. But even though he was honorable, Roland didn't go easy on the giant and killed him in their next fight, thrusting a spear into his navel. I think this could be the inspiration for how his fight against the Pyro Archon will go, as I can see their battle probably lasting a long time too. And she shares a secret with our traveler, as the giant did with Roland. This translation is from the wiki, so correct me if it's wrong, but in the Travail trailer, the original text translates to something like, "The rules of war are carved into the bodies of all living things. The defeated become the embers of the fires of war, while the victors will reignite the embers," which can be interpreted to hint towards the victors of the Cataclysm, the Archons, reigniting the war of Khaenri'ah against Celestia. This is already the case with the Tsaritsa, but perhaps the Pyro Archon wants to defeat Celestia too, and tells a secret to our traveler and Capitano that allows him to defeat her in battle. This secret is implied to be strange to share, as Dainsleif tells us that she has her reasons for doing so, which to me says that it's something Celestia wouldn't want her to share, or is bad for her personally. It could even be that she knows a weakness of Celestia's that she shares with us, and is killed by them for it. I have a feeling that her nation has been punished before by Celestia, which is why we haven't heard much about it so far, and could be the reason she takes a more active role against them, unlike the other Archons. So to sum it up, Capitano has a similar focus on justice like Roland and Naberius, with it being their main trait. He wears a helmet that looks a lot like Roland's mask to hide his face. Both Roland and Capitano are incredibly strong, with Roland soloing the Abyss until the last floor, and all three are associated with ravens. The ties between Mondstadt and Khaenri'ah could set up a conflict a lot of us are expecting, where Mondstadt is invaded by the Abyss Order, perhaps as a way to reach the gateway to Celestia that seems to be hidden there. So, do you think it's possible that Capitano is Roland? It's hard to say anything definitively with how far ahead we're looking, but from what I've found, I'd be pretty happy if he was, especially if it might mean we get to go to the moon ourselves. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below, as I always appreciate your feedback. If you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching until the end. I hope you enjoyed the video and it gave you some ideas regarding the lore. If it did, consider leaving a like, subscribing and sharing with a friend, as it all helps me out. Good luck on your wishes, and I hope you have a great day.